Berlin, 1942. A voice flows through radio speakers across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. Smooth, cultured, speaking perfect English with a slight British accent. The voice belongs to a radio host broadcasting propaganda for the Third Reich, designed to demoralize Allied soldiers and spread defeatism among British and American audiences. The Nazis called him one of their most valuable propaganda assets. Millions listen to his broadcasts. Allied commanders worry about his influence on troop morale. But there's a secret so carefully guarded that even most Nazi officials don't know the truth. That radio host, speaking into a microphone in a Berlin studio, reading scripts written by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, is actually working for the Allies. Every broadcast he makes has been carefully crafted to subtly undermine Nazi propaganda while appearing to support it. Every word he speaks serves two masters. He is a double agent, operating in the most exposed, dangerous position imaginable, broadcasting propaganda for the enemy while secretly serving his own side. His name was Edward Deitz, though few remember it today. He was a German radio broadcaster who worked for the Nazi regime's foreign-language propaganda operations. But Deitz was also secretly providing intelligence to the Allies, suddenly sabotaging Nazi propaganda, and walking a tightrope between serving Hitler's regime and betraying it. One mistake, one suspicious phrase, one moment of hesitation would mean torture, execution, and the death of his family. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of the most extraordinary and forgotten stories of World War II propaganda and espionage, the radio host who became a double agent. This is the story of how one voice, broadcast across continents, fought a secret war using words as weapons. How a man turned propaganda into counter-propaganda without the Nazis noticing. And how the most dangerous espionage operation might be speaking into a microphone while surrounded by enemies who are listening to every word. The Voice of the Reich, Nazi Radio Propaganda. To understand Edward Deitz's extraordinary position, we must first understand the role of radio propaganda in World War II. Radio was the most powerful mass communication medium of the era, reaching millions of people simultaneously. The Nazis understood this power and built a massive radio propaganda apparatus designed to spread their ideology and demoralize their enemies. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, viewed radio as the ultimate propaganda tool. Within Germany, radio broadcasts reinforced Nazi ideology, spread anti-Semitic messages, and maintained public support for the war. But Goebbels also understood that radio could reach beyond German borders, into enemy territory, spreading defeatism and confusion among Allied populations and soldiers. The Nazis established multiple foreign-language radio services broadcasting propaganda across Europe and beyond. Radio Berlin broadcast in English, targeting Britain and America. Other services broadcast in French, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese, and dozens of other languages. These broadcasts mixed music, news coverage slanted toward Nazi perspectives, and direct propaganda designed to undermine enemy morale. The broadcasts followed sophisticated psychological warfare principles. They didn't simply shout Nazi slogans. That would be dismissed as obvious propaganda. Instead, they presented themselves as alternative news sources, offering information that Allied governments supposedly suppressed. They exploited real tensions, class divisions in Britain, racial tensions in America, colonial resentments in British territories, and amplified them through carefully crafted messages. The English-language broadcasts were particularly important. They targeted British citizens, American soldiers stationed in Europe, and English-speaking populations worldwide. The broadcasters used British and American music to attract listeners, then interspersed propaganda messages between songs. A typical broadcast might play swing music, then discuss Allied military setbacks, then more music, then commentary about food rationing in Britain, suggesting the British government was incompetent and the war unwinnable. The Nazis recruited native English speakers or Germans who spoke flawless English to broadcast these programs. The most famous was William Joyce, nicknamed Lord Haw-Haw by British listeners who mocked his affected upper-class accent. Joyce broadcast Nazi propaganda to Britain throughout the war, becoming one of history's most notorious traitors. After the war, he was captured, tried for treason, and executed. But Joyce wasn't the only voice broadcasting Nazi propaganda in English. Several others worked for Radio Berlin's English service, each with distinct styles and audiences. Some broadcasters targeted specific groups: American soldiers, British civilians, merchant seamen. Some focused on news commentary, others on entertainment mixed with propaganda. The Nazi propaganda apparatus was sophisticated, segmented, and professionally produced. This was the world Edward Deitz entered when he began broadcasting for Radio Berlin in the early 1940s. Deitz had worked in German radio before the war, developing skills in broadcasting, script writing, and voice performance. When Nazi authorities approached him to join the foreign-language propaganda service, he agreed. To outside observers, this appeared to be another German intellectual serving the Reich's war effort. But Deitz harbored secret loyalties that made him uniquely positioned to wage a different kind of war. Deitz's background provided perfect cover for what would become his double-agent activities. He was educated, articulate, and possessed the cultural knowledge to speak convincingly to British and American audiences. He understood English-speaking culture, literature, and music well enough to seem credible. The Nazis trusted him because he appeared to be a loyal German professional, simply doing his job. But beneath this surface, Deitz was developing a plan that would make him one of the war's most remarkable double agents. Edward Deitz's transformation from Nazi propaganda broadcaster to Allied double agent didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual process driven by ideological conviction, moral revulsion at Nazi atrocities, and opportunity created by his unique position. Understanding how he became a double agent reveals both his courage and the careful planning required for such dangerous work. Deitz had never been a committed Nazi. He'd worked in radio broadcasting because it was his profession, not because of ideological fervor. As World War II progressed and Nazi atrocities became undeniable, Deitz grew increasingly disturbed by the regime he served. He witnessed the persecution of Jewish colleagues. He heard private discussions among Nazi officials that revealed the Holocaust's extent. He saw how propaganda twisted truth into lies that sent young men to die for an evil cause. By 1942, Deitz had decided he couldn't simply continue broadcasting Nazi propaganda without attempting to subvert it. But how could a radio host in the heart of Berlin, surrounded by Nazi security services, possibly work against the regime? The answer came through a chance connection with anti-Nazi resistance networks operating within Germany itself. German resistance to Hitler is often forgotten, overshadowed by the Nazis' grip on power. But throughout the war, small networks of Germans opposed to Hitler operated in dangerous secrecy. These included military officers, intellectuals, civil servants, and ordinary citizens who risked everything to undermine the regime. Some engaged in sabotage. Others provided intelligence to the Allies. Still others simply preserved information about Nazi crimes, knowing they'd eventually face justice. Deitz made contact with one such network through personal connections that remain partially obscure even in declassified documents. A colleague, a friend of a friend, a careful conversation in a place where surveillance was difficult. Exactly how Dietze connected to resistance networks is unclear, deliberately obscured to protect sources even decades later. But the connection was made. Through this network, Dietze was put in contact with Allied intelligence. The connection ran through neutral countries, probably Switzerland or Sweden, where Allied intelligence officers could communicate with German resistance networks. Messages traveled slowly, passed through multiple intermediaries to protect all involved. But eventually, Allied intelligence recognized the extraordinary opportunity Dietze represented. A radio broadcaster working inside Nazi propaganda operations could provide unique intelligence and conduct psychological warfare operations that would be impossible through any other channel. Allied intelligence officers, probably from British MI6's political warfare executive, established a relationship with Dietze, providing guidance on how he could serve Allied interests while maintaining his cover as a loyal Nazi broadcaster. The arrangement was simple in concept, but terrifyingly difficult in execution. Dietze would continue broadcasting Nazi propaganda scripts as written, maintaining his cover and Nazi trust. But he would also subtly modify scripts, insert coded messages for Allied intelligence, and craft broadcasts in ways that undermined rather than reinforced Nazi propaganda objectives. Additionally, he would gather intelligence from his position inside Radio Berlin and pass it through resistance networks to Allied handlers. The Allies couldn't provide Dietze with sophisticated spy equipment, dead drops, invisible ink, encryption devices, because possessing such materials would guarantee his execution if discovered. Instead, communication relied on human networks, messages hidden in innocuous correspondence, and Dietze's own intelligence coded into his broadcasts in ways only Allied intelligence officers trained to listen for them would recognize. Dietze accepted this mission knowing the consequences of failure. The Gestapo was fanatically efficient at uncovering resistance networks. Dozens of German resistance members were being arrested, tortured, and executed throughout the war. Dietze's family would also face collective punishment if his activities were discovered. Nazi policy dictated that traitors' families shared their fate. Yet Dietze proceeded, driven by conviction that serving the Allied cause against Nazism justified the risks. The double game. How Dietze operated. Operating as a double agent while broadcasting Nazi propaganda required extraordinary psychological skill, meticulous attention to detail, and nerves of steel. Edward Dietze developed sophisticated techniques for serving Allied interests while appearing to loyally serve the Nazi regime. His methods revealed both the art of double agent work and the possibilities of subtle psychological warfare. Dietze's primary technique was script modification. Radio Berlin's propaganda scripts were written by Goebbels' ministry officials and handed to broadcasters to read on air. Dietze couldn't dramatically change these scripts. That would be immediately noticed. Instead, he made subtle alterations that changed meaning or undermined effectiveness while remaining undetectable to Nazi supervisors. For example, a propaganda script might instruct Dietze to read, "British workers suffer under capitalist oppression while their government wastes resources on a hopeless war." Dietze might subtly change emphasis, timing, or tone to communicate skepticism rather than conviction. He'd pause before key words, inject slight hesitation, or use inflection that suggested doubt. To Nazi supervisors listening casually, the broadcast sounded fine. But to trained Allied intelligence officers analyzing recordings, the subtle signals communicated that the speaker didn't believe what he was saying. Dietze also exploited propaganda's inherent contradictions. Nazi propaganda frequently made claims that contradicted previous broadcasts or reality. Dietze would carefully choose which claims to emphasize and which to minimize, subtly highlighting the contradictions. He'd pair obviously false claims with true information, training listeners to question everything from Nazi sources. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, using the enemy's own propaganda to undermine itself. Coded messages were embedded in Dietzy's broadcasts for Allied intelligence officers monitoring Radio Berlin transmissions. These codes were usually verbal rather than written. Specific phrases, unusual word choices, or patterns that conveyed information. For instance, mentioning a particular piece of music might signal that important intelligence would be transmitted through other channels. Using an unusual metaphor might convey information about German military movements Dietzy had learned through his position at Radio Berlin. The codes had to be subtle enough that Nazi sensors wouldn't notice anything suspicious, but clear enough that Allied intelligence officers listening for them could identify and decode them. This required extensive prearrangement through the resistance network channels connecting Dietzy to Allied handlers. Allied intelligence would provide Dietzy with code phrases and instructions through the slow, dangerous communication chains running through neutral countries. Dietzy also gathered intelligence through his position at Radio Berlin. He observed which propaganda themes Nazi officials emphasized, revealing German strategic concerns and priorities. He noted when certain broadcasters disappeared or new ones arrived, potentially indicating personnel changes reflecting broader Nazi policy shifts. He overheard conversations among Radio Berlin's staff about the war's progress, military developments, and internal Nazi politics. This intelligence was carefully memorized and passed through resistance network channels. Dietzy couldn't write anything down. Possession of unauthorized notes would raise suspicions. Instead, he developed excellent memory techniques, categorizing and retaining information until he could pass it along. The intelligence reached Allied handlers through elaborate chains. Dietzy would communicate to a resistance contact, who'd pass information to another contact, who'd transmit it to Switzerland or Sweden, where Allied intelligence officers would receive and analyze it. Dietzy's most sophisticated technique was psychological manipulation of his audience. He understood that effective propaganda works by reinforcing what audiences already believe or want to believe. Nazi propaganda scripts tried to make British and American audiences believe they were losing the war, their governments were incompetent, and continuing to fight was futile. But Dietzy subtly crafted his delivery to produce opposite effects. He'd read defeatist propaganda in tones that suggested desperation rather than confidence. He'd present Nazi claims of victory with inflections that communicated doubt. He'd pair propaganda messages with music choices that contradicted the emotional tone Nazi officials intended. A propaganda message about German victories would be followed by melancholic music rather than triumphant marches, subtly communicating defeat rather than victory. These techniques required understanding Allied psychology as well as German. Dietzy had to anticipate how British and American audiences would interpret his broadcasts. Would they dismiss obvious propaganda? Would they be influenced by subtle messaging? Would they recognize the coded signals Allied intelligence officers were listening for? Dietzy was conducting psychological warfare operations that had to work on multiple levels simultaneously, fueling Nazi supervisors while communicating truth to Allied audiences and intelligence services. The danger was constant. Nazi security services monitored Radio Berlin broadcasts, listening for any deviation from approved propaganda. The Gestapo investigated Radio Berlin staff periodically, watching for signs of disloyalty. Dietzy had to maintain perfect operational security, ensuring his double-agent activities left no traces that might be discovered during investigations. One intercepted message, one suspicious script modification, one moment where his true loyalties showed through, any of these could lead to arrest, torture, and execution. The intelligence, what Dietzy revealed. The intelligence Edward Dietzy provided to Allied intelligence services was diverse and valuable, revealing aspects of Nazi propaganda operations, internal German politics, and strategic thinking that would have been difficult to obtain through other espionage channels.
His unique position inside the propaganda apparatus provided windows into how Nazi leadership thought and what they feared. Deitz's most immediate intelligence value was revealing Nazi propaganda strategies and priorities. By observing which propaganda themes German officials emphasized, Allied intelligence could infer German strategic concerns and priorities. When Radio Berlin broadcasts focused heavily on Atlantic U-boat successes, it suggested Germany was worried about maintaining submarine warfare effectiveness. When propaganda emphasized Soviet barbarism on the Eastern Front, it indicated German anxiety about the Red Army's advance. This strategic intelligence helped Allied psychological warfare operations craft counter-propaganda. Knowing what themes the Germans emphasized allowed Allied propagandists to directly counter those messages. If German propaganda claimed U-boats were destroying Allied shipping, Allied radio could emphasize convoy successes and increasing U-boat losses. The intelligence Deitze provided allowed the Allies to fight German propaganda more effectively. Deitze also reported on personnel within Radio Berlin and the broader propaganda apparatus. He identified which broadcasters were committed Nazis and which might be potential defectors or intelligence sources. He noted when officials fell from favor, indicating internal Nazi political shifts. He observed tensions between different propaganda agencies, Goebbels' ministry, military propaganda offices, foreign ministry information services, revealing bureaucratic conflicts that the Allies could potentially exploit. Technical intelligence about German broadcasting capabilities was valuable for Allied radio jamming operations and counter-broadcasting efforts. Deitze provided information about Radio Berlin's transmission schedules, frequencies, power levels, and technical capabilities. This intelligence helped the Allies develop strategies to jam German broadcasts or to time Allied propaganda broadcasts for maximum effectiveness. More significantly, Deitze occasionally obtained intelligence about broader German war efforts through his position and connections. Radio Berlin wasn't isolated from other Nazi operations. Officials and military officers visited the studios. Deitze overheard conversations, observed documents, and learned details about military operations, resource shortages, and strategic planning that went beyond propaganda matters. One documented intelligence coup involved Deitze learning about German anxiety regarding Allied bombing campaign effectiveness. Through conversations with Nazi officials visiting Radio Berlin, Deitze gathered information about how bombing was affecting German industrial production and civilian morale. He reported that despite official propaganda claiming bombing had minimal effect, internal Nazi assessments acknowledged serious damage and growing public demoralization. This intelligence confirmed that Allied strategic bombing was achieving its objectives, information that supported continuing and intensifying bombing campaigns. Deitze also provided intelligence about Nazi plans for propaganda operations targeting specific Allied groups. When German propagandists planned campaigns targeting African American soldiers, attempting to exploit racial tensions in America, Deitze warned Allied intelligence. This advance warning allowed Allied psychological warfare units to prepare counter-propaganda and brief African American troops about German propaganda tactics, reducing the campaign's effectiveness. Information about Nazi internal morale and elite attitudes toward the war proved valuable for Allied strategic assessments. Deitze reported observations about Nazi officials' private pessimism contrasting with public confidence. He noted when officials discussed defeat scenarios, revealed concerns about post-war consequences, or expressed doubts about Germany's ability to win. This intelligence helped Allied commanders understand that, despite public Nazi defiance, German leadership increasingly recognized inevitable defeat. The intelligence Deitze provided wasn't always dramatic or immediately decisive. Much of it was incremental, small pieces of information that contributed to larger intelligence pictures. But the cumulative value was significant. Over months and years of double-agent work, Deitze contributed meaningfully to Allied understanding of Nazi propaganda operations, internal German politics, and broader strategic situations. The psychological toll: living a double life. Operating as a double agent while broadcasting Nazi propaganda exacted enormous psychological costs on Edward Deitze. The constant fear of discovery, the moral complexity of speaking words supporting evil while secretly opposing it, and the isolation of maintaining deep cover without confidants created crushing mental and emotional burdens. Dietz lived in constant fear. Every broadcast might be the one where he made a fatal mistake. Every conversation with Nazi officials could reveal his true loyalties through an unguarded word or expression. Every knock on his apartment door might be Gestapo agents arriving to arrest him. The fear was relentless, inescapable, exhausting. Sleep was difficult. Dietz would lie awake reviewing his actions, analyzing whether he'd said anything suspicious, worrying about security breaches in the resistance networks connecting him to Allied handlers. Nightmares about discovery, torture, and execution plagued him. The psychological stress manifested physically: weight loss, digestive problems, tension headaches. But Dietz couldn't seek medical help without risking questions about stress sources. The moral complexity was equally burdensome. Dietz spoke Nazi propaganda into microphones, knowing millions heard his voice, associating him with Reich ideology. He read scripts denying the Holocaust, attacking Jews, praising Hitler, justifying Nazi aggression. Even though he subtly undermined these messages and secretly served the Allies, the words still came from his mouth. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. Dietz worried about listeners who might be influenced by his broadcast propaganda, despite his subtle sabotage efforts. What if British or American soldiers heard his broadcasts and were demoralized? What if his words even unintentionally served Nazi purposes? This guilt haunted him. He was trying to fight Nazis by working within their propaganda machine, but the very act of broadcasting their messages made him complicit in their evil. Isolation compounded the psychological burden. Dietz couldn't confide in anyone about his double agent activities. His family didn't know. Telling them would endanger them further and force them to share their unbearable secret. His Radio Berlin colleagues were potential Gestapo informants. Even within resistance networks, operational security required strict compartmentalization. Dietz couldn't know who else was involved or discuss his specific activities. This isolation meant that Dietz had no one to share his fears with, no one to reassure him, no one to help process the moral complexity of his situation. He was entirely alone with his secrets, his fears, his doubts, and his guilt. The psychological isolation was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Dietz also lived with awareness that his family faced terrible danger because of his choices. Nazi collective punishment policies meant that if Dietz was discovered, his wife and children would be arrested and likely executed alongside him. Every day Dietz continued his double agent activities, he risked his family's lives. This created agonizing moral calculations. Was serving the Allied cause worth endangering his children? How could he justify choices that might make his wife a widow and his children orphans or corpses? But abandoning his double agent work also seemed morally impossible. Dietz believed Nazi Germany represented profound evil that had to be opposed. He had unique opportunities to contribute to Allied victory and undermine Nazi propaganda. Walking away from this opportunity, choosing his family's safety over fighting Nazism seemed like moral cowardice. But continuing seemed like sacrificing his family for abstract principles. There was no good choice, only terrible dilemmas. The work itself was emotionally exhausting. Every broadcast required intense concentration, maintaining perfect performance while inserting subtle sabotage in coded messages. Every interaction with Nazi colleagues required careful deception, playing the role of loyal German broadcaster while secretly despising everything the Reich represented. Dietz was performing constantly, and the performance was literally life-and-death theater. Over time, this psychological pressure changed Dietz. He became more paranoid, more withdrawn, more emotionally numb. Friends and family noticed changes in his personality. He seemed distant, preoccupied, troubled. But Dietz couldn't explain what was wrong. He simply had to endure, maintaining his cover and his sanity as best he could, knowing that every day might be his last as a free man. The psychological toll of double agent work is often underestimated. We imagine spies as glamorous figures living exciting lives. But the reality for someone like Dietz was constant terror, crushing moral complexity, complete isolation, and agonizing worry about loved ones endangered by choices made for abstract principles.
Dietz was psychologically tortured daily, and he endured it because he believed the cause justified the suffering. The close calls, near discovery. Throughout his years as a double-agent broadcaster, Eduard Dietz faced multiple moments when discovery seemed imminent. These close calls reveal both the extraordinary dangers he faced and the skill required to survive as a double agent operating in the heart of Nazi Germany. One documented incident occurred in 1943 when Gestapo investigators conducted a routine security sweep at Radio Berlin. All personnel were questioned about their loyalty, backgrounds investigated, and activities scrutinized. Dietze faced interrogation by Gestapo officers trained to detect deception and disloyalty. They asked about his political beliefs, his associations, his activities outside work. Any hesitation, any inconsistency, any sign of nervousness could trigger deeper investigation. Dietze had prepared for this possibility. He'd developed a complete cover story, memories of minor Nazi Party activities, expressions of ideological commitment, carefully crafted answers to anticipated questions. But preparation couldn't eliminate fear. During the interrogation, Dietze maintained outward calm while internally terrified. The Gestapo officers watched his every reaction, looking for tells that might indicate deception. One particular exchange nearly ended Dietze's operation. A Gestapo investigator asked why Dietze had never joined the Nazi Party despite working for the regime's propaganda apparatus. This was a dangerous question. Many Germans avoided party membership to maintain distance from Nazi ideology. But for someone working in propaganda, lack of party membership could indicate insufficient loyalty. Dietze responded that he'd believed his professional broadcasting work served the Reich more effectively than formal party membership, that his skills contributed to Germany's cause regardless of bureaucratic affiliations. This was a calculated answer, deflecting the question while expressing loyalty without committing to provable falsehoods. The Gestapo officers seemed skeptical but moved on. Dietze had passed the immediate test, but the close call left him shaken for weeks afterward. Another dangerous moment came when one of Dietze's resistance network contacts was arrested by the Gestapo. Under torture, resistance members sometimes revealed information about their networks before they died. Dietze learned through whispered warnings that his contact had been compromised. He didn't know whether his connection to the network had been revealed. For days, Dietze expected Gestapo arrest at any moment. During this period, Dietze had to continue broadcasting normally while preparing for possible arrest. He couldn't flee. That would confirm guilt and endanger his family. He couldn't warn other network members. Communication channels were potentially compromised. He simply had to maintain his cover and hope that his contact hadn't revealed his identity under torture. Eventually, days passed without arrest, suggesting that either his contact had died without revealing information, or that the Gestapo hadn't yet acted on what they learned. The uncertainty was agonizing. Technical problems during broadcasts occasionally created near disasters. Broadcasting was live. There were no recordings that could be edited. If Dietze made mistakes or spoke unintended words, they went out instantly to audiences across Europe. On at least one occasion, Dietze nearly spoke coded phrases intended only for Allied intelligence officers at the wrong moment, almost revealing that his broadcasts contained hidden messages. He caught himself just in time, covering the near slip with a cough and continuing with the approved script. Nazi paranoia about sabotage within propaganda operations created constant scrutiny. Officials suspected that Allied intelligence might try to infiltrate Radio Berlin or recruit double agents among broadcasters. This suspicion meant Dietze was always potentially under observation. Colleagues might be informants watching for signs of disloyalty. Technical staff might monitor broadcasts for unauthorized deviations. The surveillance pressure never relented.
One particularly terrifying incident involved a Nazi official questioning why Dietze seemed unenthused when reading certain propaganda scripts. The official had noticed that Dietze's delivery varied. Some scripts were read with energy and conviction, others with what seemed like reluctance. This observation was dangerously perceptive. Dietze was indeed reading scripts differently based on content, subtly undermining messages he found particularly repugnant. Dietze had to provide convincing explanation. He claimed that he'd been experiencing health problems affecting his voice and energy levels, that some days he simply felt physically weaker than others. He produced medical documentation for minor ailments to support this claim. The explanation was accepted, but the close observation reminded Dietze how carefully Nazi officials monitored broadcasts and how easily his subtle sabotage efforts could be detected. These close calls accumulated psychological damage. Each incident reinforced how precarious Dietze's position was, how easily everything could collapse, how constantly he operated on the edge of discovery and death. The stress compounded, eroding his psychological resilience. But he continued, driven by conviction that his work mattered enough to justify the risks and the suffering. The Endgame: Survival and Liberation. As World War II progressed towards inevitable German defeat, Eduard Dietze faced new challenges and dangers. The collapsing Nazi regime became increasingly paranoid, violent, and unpredictable. Surviving the final months of the war while maintaining his double-agent cover required extraordinary luck and skill. By 1944, Allied bombing of Berlin intensified. Radio Berlin facilities were damaged in raids, forcing broadcasts to relocate to emergency studios. The chaos created both opportunities and dangers for Dietze. Disrupted routines made it harder for security services to maintain surveillance, providing more freedom to conduct intelligence activities. But the chaos also meant increased paranoia, with Nazi officials looking for scapegoats and traitors to blame for Germany's deteriorating situation.
The July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler triggered massive Gestapo purges. Thousands suspected of disloyalty or connections to resistance networks were arrested and executed. Dietze feared that his resistance network connections might be exposed during these investigations. He prepared for arrest, destroying any evidence that might link him to intelligence activities and mentally rehearsing cover stories for interrogation. Miraculously, Dietze avoided arrest during the purges. Whether through luck, effective operational security, or the chaos-overwhelming German counterintelligence, Dietze's double-agent activities remained undiscovered. But the close call reinforced how thin the line was between survival and execution. As Soviet forces approached Berlin from the east and Allied forces advanced from the west in early 1945, the Nazi propaganda apparatus descended into chaos. Some Radio Berlin staff fled Berlin, trying to escape Soviet capture. Others remained, broadcasting increasingly desperate propaganda, claiming imminent German victory even as the Reich collapsed around them. Dietze faced decisions about how to survive the final days while maintaining his cover and protecting his family. The last weeks of World War II in Europe were among the most dangerous Dietze faced. Fanatical Nazis executed suspected traitors without trials. Soviet forces advancing into Berlin showed little mercy to Germans they captured. The complete collapse of order meant violence could come from any direction. Dietze tried to position himself and his family for survival, regardless of whether the Soviets or Western allies reached their part of Berlin first. Radio Berlin's final broadcasts occurred in late April 1945, as Soviet forces fought their way into central Berlin. The broadcast became chaotic, mixing propaganda with genuine information about the collapse. Dietze made his last broadcast knowing that Nazi Germany was hours or days from final defeat. The regime he'd pretended to serve loyally was disintegrating. The war he'd fought secretly was ending. On May 2, 1945, Soviet forces captured Radio Berlin facilities. Dietze surrendered to Soviet soldiers, identifying himself as a broadcaster. The Soviets arrested him along with other Radio Berlin personnel, viewing them as Nazi propagandists. This was the final cruel irony. Dietze had risked everything working as a double agent for the Allies, but Soviet forces didn't know this. To them, he was simply another Nazi to be imprisoned. Dietze spent weeks in Soviet custody, questioned about his activities at Radio Berlin. He tried explaining his double agent work, but Soviet interrogators were skeptical. Many captured Germans claimed they'd secretly opposed the Nazis or worked for the Allies. These claims were often lies told by war criminals trying to avoid punishment. Dietze had no documentation proving his double agent status, no way to verify his claims. Eventually, through channels connecting Soviet, British, and American intelligence services, Dietze's story was verified. British MI6 confirmed that Dietze had indeed worked as a double agent providing intelligence and undermining Nazi propaganda. This confirmation likely saved Dietze's life. Without it, he might have been tried as a Nazi propagandist and imprisoned or executed. Dietze was released from Soviet custody and eventually made contact with British intelligence officers in the chaotic post-war environment. They debriefed him extensively about his experiences, gathering final intelligence about Radio Berlin operations and Nazi propaganda strategies. The debriefing also served as recognition. After years of dangerous isolation, Dietze could finally speak openly about what he'd done, be acknowledged for his courage, and receive thanks for his service. But survival came with costs. Dietze's health had deteriorated under years of psychological stress. His family had been traumatized by the war's final chaos. His reputation was complicated. Many Germans viewed him as a Nazi collaborator who'd worked for Radio Berlin, unaware of his double agent activities. And the world was entering the Cold War, where attention quickly shifted from World War II's complexities to new conflicts. Edward Dietze survived World War II, but history largely forgot him. Unlike famous double agents like Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, who received recognition and publicity, Dietze remained obscure. His story appeared briefly in classified intelligence documents but didn't enter popular historical consciousness. Why was this remarkable double agent forgotten? Part of the reason was classification. Intelligence services kept double agent operations secret for decades after the war. Information about Dietze's activities remained classified until long after his death, preventing historians from telling his story. By the time documents were declassified, few people remembered or cared about the details of World War II propaganda operations.
Another factor was that Dietze's work didn't produce dramatic, obvious results. He didn't steal invasion plans or assassinate Nazi officials. His contributions were subtle. Intelligence gathered incrementally, propaganda slightly undermined, coded messages sent over months and years. These contributions mattered collectively, but didn't create memorable single events that make good stories. Additionally, Dietze's position was morally complicated in ways that made him difficult to celebrate. He spoke Nazi propaganda for years, even if he subtly undermined it. He worked willingly for Radio Berlin, even if secretly serving the Allies. Post-war Germany struggled with questions about collaboration and resistance. Dietze occupied uncomfortable middle ground, neither obvious hero nor clear villain, but something more complex that Germans preferred not to examine closely. His own reticence contributed to obscurity. After the war, Dietze didn't seek publicity or recognition. He'd lived in fear for years, maintaining operational security and avoiding attention. This habit continued after the war. He quietly rebuilt his life, avoiding discussions of his wartime activities. He gave few interviews, wrote no memoirs, and discouraged attention. But Dietze's forgotten story matters precisely because it reveals overlooked dimensions of World War II. We remember the soldiers who fought on battlefields, the resistance fighters who committed sabotage, the spies who stole secrets. But we forget people like Dietze who fought in more subtle ways, broadcasting propaganda while secretly undermining it, gathering intelligence while maintaining deep cover, risking everything while doing work that looked like collaboration. Dietze's story also illuminates the psychological complexity of double agent work. He lived in constant terror, moral anguish, and complete isolation. He made impossible choices that endangered his family for abstract principles. He performed loyalty to evil while secretly serving good, a psychological burden few could endure. His courage wasn't the dramatic courage of soldiers charging into battle, but the quiet courage of enduring psychological torture daily for years without breaking.
The intelligence and psychological warfare contributions Dietz made were real, even if difficult to quantify. Every piece of intelligence he provided helped build Allied understanding of Nazi operations. Every subtle undermining of propaganda broadcasts reduced Nazi psychological warfare effectiveness. Every coded message he sent contributed to the larger Allied intelligence picture. His work saved lives and helped defeat Nazism, even if we can't point to specific battles won or decisions changed because of his specific contributions. Dietz's story also raises profound questions about the nature of resistance and collaboration. He worked for the Nazi propaganda apparatus, an institution central to maintaining Nazi power and spreading evil ideology. Yet he worked there to fight Nazis from within. Was he a collaborator or a resistance fighter? The answer is both, simultaneously. This moral complexity challenges simple narratives about World War II, reminding us that resistance took many forms, some of them deeply uncomfortable. For journalists and broadcasters today, Dietz's story offers both inspiration and a warning. He demonstrated that media professionals can resist authoritarianism even from within state propaganda systems. But he also showed the terrible costs of such resistance, the psychological damage, the moral compromises, the dangers to self and family. His example proves that fighting propaganda from within is possible, but also reveals why such fights exact devastating personal prices. Edward Dietz died in the 1960s, largely forgotten by history. His obituary likely mentioned his broadcasting career, but probably not his double-agent activities, which remained classified. His children might not have fully understood what their father had done during the war. His story seemed destined to disappear entirely, lost among millions of World War II stories that history overlooked. But now, decades later, as classified documents are released and historians piece together the complete picture of World War II intelligence operations, Dietz's story is finally being told. He deserves to be remembered, not as a perfect hero, his story is too morally complex for that, but as a courageous person who fought evil in whatever ways he could, using his profession as a weapon, risking everything to oppose the Nazi regime from inside its own propaganda machine. This was Cipher Tales, decoding the hidden history of World War II propaganda and espionage. Edward Dietz's story proves that resistance can happen anywhere, even inside enemy propaganda operations, that radio broadcasts can carry secret messages alongside official ones, that speaking words supporting evil while secretly undermining it requires extraordinary courage, and that history's forgotten heroes sometimes fought the most remarkable battles in the most unlikely places. If you want to decode more extraordinary secrets from World War II, subscribe to Cipher Tales. Hit that like button if this story of the forgotten radio host double agent amazed you. Comment below and tell us, what other forgotten World War II heroes should we decode next? The women codebreakers of Arlington Hall? The Hollywood directors who made propaganda films? The musicians who encoded messages in compositions? Edward Dietz spent years speaking into a microphone, broadcasting words written by his enemies while secretly serving those fighting against them. He lived in fear every day, knowing that one mistake meant death. He endured psychological torture that would break most people, and history forgot him. But we remember him now. We decode his story from classified documents and fragmentary records. We honor the courage it took to fight from inside the enemy's propaganda machine. We acknowledge the impossible choices he made and the costs he paid. And we recognize that sometimes the greatest heroes are those history overlooked, the quiet fighters who waged shadow wars using voices, words, and broadcasts as their weapons. The radio broadcasts Edward Dietz made are lost to time, the recordings destroyed or disappeared. But his courage endures. The intelligence he gathered mattered. The propaganda he undermined helped defeat Nazism. And his story, finally being decoded decades later, reminds us that resistance takes many forms. Heroism isn't always obvious, and the fight against evil happens in unexpected places, even inside the enemy's radio studios. The forgotten radio host who worked as a double agent deserves to be forgotten no longer. His voice is finally being heard again, not through crackling radio speakers, but through the pages of history, finally giving him the recognition he earned. Eduard Dietz fought World War II with the only weapons he had: his voice, his intelligence, and his courage. And though history forgot him for decades, his story proves that even in the heart of darkness, voices of resistance could be heard by those listening carefully enough.